High in the misty ridges where pine whispers never end, a girl from the city stood trembling before a cabin, barely holding its bones together. She had been sent here in shame, exiled for disobedience, to live under the watch of a boy the townsfolk called a hermit, a soul as wild and wordless as the mountains themselves. Days turned to silence, silence to rhythm, and rhythm to something tender neither could name. In the creak of old wood and the scent of pine smoke, she began to see that punishment could hold unexpected peace. But beneath that peace lay secrets carved deep into the hills, secrets that could either bind them or break them. What happens when the heart finds refuge in the very place meant to humble it? Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from. And if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. The carriage had left her at the foot of the trail without so much as a backward glance. Its wheels groaned over the frozen mud, fading into the distance until only the whisper of the forest remained. Ilara stood there, wrapped in a coat far too fine for the place she now faced. Her fingers touched the locket at her throat, a habit born of loneliness. Inside, her mother's faded smile looked back, calm and knowing, as if foreseeing this moment of exile. She began the climb toward the cabin. The path was narrow, strewn with roots that caught her boots and tested her patience. Every few steps she stopped to breathe, glancing back at the valley below. Civilization already seemed a lifetime away. Above, clouds gathered like slow-moving thoughts, heavy with unspoken rain. Somewhere beyond the ridge, smoke curled from a chimney. When she reached it, the cabin appeared smaller than she imagined, as if retreating from the world around it. The man waiting at the door, Rowan, did not move to greet her. His presence was still, deliberate, as though the mountain itself had shaped him. His eyes met hers briefly, unreadable, then drifted toward the pack at her feet. "You'll need to bring your own firewood," he said simply, turning away. The words cut sharper than intended. She followed him inside, brushing past a hanging pelt and a table made from rough pine slabs. The air smelled of sap, smoke, and solitude. He moved like someone accustomed to silence, filling it instead of fearing it. Ilara set down her belongings and caught her reflection in a tin mirror, pale, uncertain, yet strangely alive. "This is where I'm to stay?" she asked. "For now," Rowan replied, not unkindly. She turned toward the single window overlooking the forest. Beyond it, the trees stood shoulder to shoulder, indifferent to her arrival. In the city, everything had boundaries, walls, names, expectations. Here there was only distance, and in that distance she felt her own shape blur as evening crept in. Rowan lit the lamp. Shadows stretched along the walls, soft and uneven. He offered her bread, coarse and dark, and a cup of water drawn from the nearby spring. It was colder than she expected, purer too. "My father thought this would teach me humility," she murmured after a while. "Maybe it will," Rowan said. Though there was no malice in it, she almost smiled. Unsure if she should, later, alone in her corner of the cabin, Ilara opened the locket again. Her mother's face glowed faintly in the lamplight. The clasp was bent. It had been that way for years. She traced the dent with her thumb, remembering how her mother used to hum while brushing her hair. That sound had been the measure of safety. Now only the mountain wind hummed, a deeper, older melody. Rowan's footsteps moved outside, steady and unhurried. Through the cracks in the wall, she could see sparks from his axe striking wood. The rhythm was almost human: work, pause, breath. She thought of the city's endless chatter, the polished lies of her father's dinners, the eyes that measured worth by wealth. Here there was no audience, only endurance. When the fire burned low, she wrapped herself in a blanket that smelled faintly of cedar. The floor creaked beneath her, the cabin breathing in the cold. She thought of her punishment not as cruelty but as displacement. She had been torn from one world and placed in another, neither cruel nor kind, only patient. The last thing she saw before sleep was the locket glinting softly beside her, a small circle of memory in a vast, indifferent dark. The storm began long before the rain. It started as a low murmur in the air, a restlessness that stirred through the pines and seeped into the cabin's seams. Ilara woke to the flicker of lightning through the window, the sharp scent of wet earth rising. She pulled her shawl close and lit a small lantern, its flame trembling like her breath. Rowan was outside, securing the roof planks before the real downpour came. She watched his figure move through the haze, methodical, strong, unhurried. Every motion seemed measured, not against time but against necessity. In his silence, she sensed a man shaped by hardship, not bitterness. Yet something about him remained guarded, as if he carried a burden the mountain could not ease. When the rain fell in earnest, he came in soaked, hanging his coat by the door. The thunder rolled overhead like a passing judgment. He sat without a word, staring into the hearth. She wanted to speak, to thank him for braving the weather, but his quiet was complete. So she returned to her corner, pretending to read one of the old books left behind by previous settlers. It was then she noticed the drawer, slightly ajar, its edge warped from dampness. Inside, wrapped in a strip of faded linen, lay a folded paper, torn along one side, the ink smeared. The writing, though fragile, was still legible enough to draw her in. "Rowan, if forgiveness still lives in you, come back before winter. The fire was never meant to spread. It was mine to bear, not yours. I've told them all, but they wouldn't listen. The rest was smudged, unreadable. But one line stood out clearly at the bottom, pressed deep into the paper, as if written in desperation. Please, don't let the mountain take you too." Ilara froze, the words burning through her calm. A woman's handwriting, elegant, trembling. She folded it back carefully, but her thoughts spun like wind-blown leaves. Who had written it? What fire? And why hide it away instead of answering? When Rowan rose to fetch more wood, she quickly slid the letter beneath a book on the table. Yet guilt prickled her conscience. The letter belonged to him, not her curiosity. Still, something in its sorrow resonated, an echo of her own exile, the feeling of being unheard. Later, when he stoked the fire, she risked a glance. His hands, scarred but steady, seemed to have known both creation and destruction. "Rowan," she said softly, "have you lived here long?" He looked up, eyes glinting in the firelight. "Long enough. And before?" "Before doesn't matter much." The finality in his tone closed the door she had barely opened. Silence fell again, punctuated only by the rhythm of rain against the roof. As the night deepened, the storm howled harder. Water trickled through a crack near the window. She hurried to place a bowl beneath the leak, then turned to find him watching her. Not harshly, just with quiet awareness. "You don't have to fix what the mountain breaks," he said. She smiled faintly. "Maybe not. But I can still try." Something softened in his expression then, fleeting but real. He nodded once before turning away. When he finally retired to his cot, Ilara sat by the hearth, the torn letter calling to her from where it lay hidden. She pulled it out again, studying the edges, the faint scorch marks. There was pain trapped in those lines, pain too raw to fade. She thought of her father's punishments, his belief that distance and silence could teach obedience. Perhaps Rowan's silence came from a similar wound, only deeper, older. Another flash of lightning illuminated the room, casting her shadow long across the wall. For a moment, it looked like her mother's silhouette, tall, composed, steady. She pressed the locket at her neck, whispering a silent apology to both the living and the dead. By dawn, the storm had passed. The forest glistened, washed clean but restless. When Rowan stepped outside, Ilara placed the letter on the table where he would see it. No words, no explanations. Just truth returned to its keeper. Hours later, when he came back in, the paper was gone. He didn't mention it, but his gaze lingered on her longer than usual, as though seeing her not as punishment, but as witness. That night, he lit an extra candle by the window. Its flame burned steady until morning, an unspoken truce, fragile as the mountain dawn. The morning after the storm broke clear and gold, sunlight streaming through the cracks in the shutters like threads of forgiveness. The forest shimmered under a thin veil of mist, every leaf jeweled with dew. Ilara stood by the cabin's door, breathing the sharp scent of wet pine. The air felt new, alive, as if the night's violence had washed away something invisible. Rowan was already outside, stacking firewood into neat, symmetrical rows. His shirt sleeves were rolled to the elbows, revealing the kind of strength that came not from pride, but from persistence. She watched in silence for a moment before stepping out to help. "I can carry the smaller pieces," she offered, half expecting him to refuse. He looked at her, then simply nodded toward the pile. "If you can lift it, it's yours." It wasn't encouragement exactly, but it wasn't rejection either. That was enough. She gathered the lighter logs and followed his rhythm, setting each piece in its place. They worked side by side, speaking little. The mountain didn't need conversation. It spoke through wind, through the soft crackle of drying wood. Inside the cabin later that day, Ilara began cleaning the shelves. Dust rose in lazy clouds, coating her hands in grey. Beneath a pile of old linens, she found an object hanging crooked on the wall. A small brass clock, its glass cracked and hands forever stopped at 3:27. The gears inside were dull with rust. She touched it gently. It was strange, she thought, how even broken things still kept their place, waiting to be noticed again. When Rowan came in, she asked, "Does it still work?" He glanced at it briefly. "It hasn't in years. Do you want me to try?" He shrugged. "You can try. But some things stop for a reason," she smiled faintly. "Or maybe they're waiting to be wound again." That night, while he fixed the roof, she sat by the fire, tools spread across the table. The clock's gears resisted her at first, but she kept at it patiently, guided by memory. Her mother used to mend small things, buttons, hinges, hearts. "Nothing's useless if it once had purpose," she used to say. The thought steadied Ilara's hands. Outside, the wind picked up again. The trees whispered low secrets. Rowan stepped inside, shaking the cold from his shoulders. He paused when he saw her, bent over the clock, hair loose around her face, lamplight glinting on brass. "You don't have to do that," he said. "I know," she replied. "But I want to." He watched her for a moment longer, then returned to his workbench. Between them, silence wove something unspoken, respect perhaps, or the slow beginning of trust. When she finally set the clock back on the wall, it didn't tick. She sighed, smiling despite herself. "Maybe you were right," she said softly. Rowan looked up from his chair by the fire. "Sometimes effort's what matters, not the result." His tone was quiet, but the words lingered. Later, as they ate supper, simple stew and bread still warm from the hearth, she noticed the way he stared into the flames. There was distance in his gaze, like someone remembering a place that no longer existed. "Was that letter from someone you cared about?" she asked carefully. He didn't move for a moment. Then he said, "Once, but caring doesn't change what's gone." She lowered her eyes, ashamed of her curiosity. Yet she sensed that he hadn't meant to wound her, only to state what life had already taught him. When the dishes were cleared, Rowan took a seat by the window, knife in hand, carving small pieces of wood into something shapeless. The steady scrape filled the room with rhythm. "Rowan," she said quietly, "why stay here? Why not go back?" "Because peace doesn't follow you. You earn it where you stand." It was the most he'd ever said in one sitting. His voice carried neither pride nor bitterness, only fact. As the fire dimmed, Ilara looked again at the clock. Still motionless, but now somehow different. She reached up and turned the winding key one last time. Nothing happened, but the act itself felt like a prayer. That night, before sleep, she wrote a single line in her small notebook. "Sometimes the quiet is not punishment, it's repair." In the deep hours, when the cabin had settled into its own breathing, a faint tick broke through the silence. Once, then twice. Then steady, Rowan, half asleep, opened his eyes at the sound. He didn't speak, didn't move. He only watched the soft light from the dying fire catch the brass face of the clock, now alive again, and for the first time in years. Something inside him began to move as well. Winter came softly that year, not in fury, but in quiet persistence. Frost crept along the window panes each morning, tracing thin white veins that shimmered when the sun broke through. Inside the cabin, life slowed to the rhythm of the fire. Days began with smoke, ended with ember. Between them stretched hours of simple, wordless labor that somehow filled the heart. Ilara had learned to chop wood now, not gracefully, but with determination. Rowan had stopped correcting her form, content to watch her find her own rhythm. Each task she once dreaded, hauling water, washing clothes, gathering pine cones for kindling, had become routine, even comforting. One morning she found him outside by the stump, knife in hand. Thin curls of wood fell to the ground like ribbons. "What are you making?" she asked, pulling her shawl tighter. He didn't look up. "Something to pass the time." She stepped closer, watching the shape take form. It was a spoon, small and rough-edged, but graceful. "You could sell those," she said. He smiled faintly. "I don't make them for selling." "For what, then?" He shrugged. "Sometimes it helps to shape something with your hands. Reminds you the world can still take form." She nodded, though she didn't fully understand. That evening, when she came in from the well, the spoon rested on the table beside her bowl. Its surface was smooth now, polished with care. Her initials, E.W., were carved delicately on the handle. She touched it with hesitation. "You made this for me?" He stirred the stew quietly, pretending not to hear. "You needed one." "It's beautiful," she whispered. He gave a small nod. Just a spoon, but she knew it wasn't just a spoon. It was acknowledgement, a soft bridge built without words. In the days that followed, she used it at every meal. Each time she lifted it, she felt a warmth not from the fire, but from something more human, more fragile. She caught him glancing at her once or twice, his gaze quickly returning to his work. Yet his eyes held no distance now, only calm understanding. When the snow deepened and the forest grew still, Ilara began reading aloud in the evenings from an old book she found on the shelf. Tales of rivers, seasons, and the endurance of ordinary lives. Rowan listened, carving in his corner, his knife's rhythm keeping time with her voice. One night she paused mid-story and asked, "Did you ever have someone to read to before?" He set the knife down. "No, didn't think I needed it. And now," he looked into the fire. "I think I was wrong." The silence that followed wasn't empty. It was full, like the pause before music resumes. The days blurred gently into each other. Ilara began baking simple bread, learned to mend clothes, and once even laughed, truly laughed, when a pine squirrel darted through the door and stole a scrap from the table. Rowan turned, startled by the sound. He hadn't heard laughter in the cabin for years. It startled him in the best way. That night, as snow fell thick outside, Ilara found him staring out the window, lost in thought. She joined him quietly. "Do you ever wish things had been different?" she asked. He took a long breath. "Sometimes, but the mountain doesn't care about wishes. It just teaches you to live with what is. And what if what is changes? Then you learn to live again." His answer hung between them, fragile as frost. Before she slept, she held the spoon once more, tracing the letters. Her name had been carved into wood by a man who rarely spoke, who lived like silence was survival. Yet through this small gift, he had said more than any confession could. When the fire dimmed to coals, she whispered softly to the dark, "Maybe we both needed to be remade." The wind outside howled, shaking the eaves, but inside everything held steady. The spoon rested on the table beside her, glowing faintly in the firelight. It was more than a utensil now. It was proof that something gentle could take root even in the harshest soil. Rowan, half awake in his chair, heard her breathing settle into sleep. His gaze lingered on the spoon, and for the first time in years he felt something shift quietly inside, a sense that maybe the mountain hadn't taken everything from him after all. Maybe it had given him someone who saw the man beneath the silence. The clock ticked softly on the wall, marking the slow, honest passage of their new time together. The storm arrived without warning. Morning broke in a wash of white, sky and earth indistinguishable, as if the world had forgotten its boundaries. The cabin trembled under the wind's weight. Rowan had seen winters like this before. Ilara hadn't. She stood by the window, arms wrapped around herself. "It's like the mountains trying to swallow everything," she whispered. "It will pass," Rowan said, hauling another log onto the fire. "It always does, but it didn't feel like it would." The wind screamed through the cracks, and snow piled high against the door. They were trapped. Days blended into nights until the clock itself felt frozen. To distract herself, Ilara decided to tidy the corners they'd long ignored. Behind a loose floorboard, her hand brushed against paper, thin, brittle, and cold. She pulled it free, a photograph, half-torn, dusted with years. "Rowan," she called softly. He turned from the stove, brow furrowing. "Where did you get that?" It was hidden under the floor. She held it out to him, her expression careful. Rowan took it, his thumb tracing the torn edge. The firelight caught the faint image, him as a boy, standing beside a man with familiar eyes and the same strong jawline. The older man's hand rested proudly on the boy's shoulder. "Your father?" she asked gently. Rowan nodded once, then looked away. "What's left of him?" She hesitated. "What happened?" He stared into the flames for a long moment. "He built this cabin with his hands, said it would be a home that never bent to the world. But after my mother died, he couldn't bear the silence. Took his rifle one winter morning and went into the woods. I found the gun 3 days later, never found him." The storm outside wailed harder, as if echoing the memory. Ilara said nothing, only sat beside him, the photo resting between them. "You never looked for him again?" she asked. "I looked until the snow erased everything," he said. "After that, I figured maybe the mountain kept him for a reason." She studied his face, the set of his jaw, the faint tremor in his voice. "You kept living here?" He nodded. "Because leaving would have meant admitting I was alone." Her throat tightened. "You aren't anymore." He glanced at her then, as if the words were too fragile to hold. The silence that followed wasn't heavy this time, it was grounding. Two people, side by side, bound by something neither could name yet. That night, the storm raged with renewed fury. The cabin shuddered, roof beams groaning. Rowan worked quickly to secure the door, but a sharp gust tore through, sending snow and splinters across the room. Ilara gasped, clutching her shawl. Rowan grabbed her hand, steady and sure. "Stay close," he ordered. For hours they fought the cold together, feeding the fire, patching gaps with rags and old cloth. When exhaustion finally claimed them, they sat before the fire, wrapped in blankets, their shoulders brushing. "Your father built this place," she said quietly. "And now you're keeping it alive." "He built it to keep the world out," Rowan murmured. "But maybe it was meant to keep someone in." Her gaze softened. "Someone like me?" He didn't answer, but the look in his eyes said enough. As the storm eased, dawn crept pale through the frosted window. The world outside lay buried under snow, white, clean, new. Ilara rose first, brushing frost from the glass. "It's beautiful," she whispered. Behind her, Rowan lifted the torn photo once more. "Maybe it's time I stopped hiding things under the floor," he said. He placed the picture on the mantel, beside the spoon he'd carved for her. Ilara smiled faintly. "Now it belongs where someone can see it." He looked at her, then nodded. "Yeah, it does." Later that morning, she found him outside, digging a path through the snow, the air clear and sharp. She joined him wordlessly, her cheeks flushed pink with cold. They worked until their breath fogged the air, and their laughter, light, genuine, rose above the crunch of their boots. For the first time, the mountain didn't feel like a prison. It felt like something alive, listening. When they came back inside, Rowan noticed the photograph again. It's torn half, like an unfinished story. "I never found the other piece," he said absently. Ilara looked up. "Maybe you weren't meant to until now." He frowned slightly. "What do you mean?" "Sometimes broken things wait for someone else to finish them," she said softly. Her words lingered long after she'd gone to bed. Rowan sat by the fire, holding the photo under the glow. The young boy in the picture looked at him like a ghost, innocent and untouched by loss. He whispered to the empty room, "Maybe it's time to start over." Outside, the storm had passed. The snow lay still, untouched, waiting for footprints. Inside, the torn photograph watched over the cabin like a quiet witness of what had been lost and what might yet be rebuilt. When the thaw came, it came suddenly. Snow gave way to wet earth. The trees whispered again, and water trickled down from the slopes like veins returning to a sleeping giant. The mountain breathed. Ilara had taken to walking the perimeter each morning, listening to the creak of thawing ice and the drip of melting snow from the eaves. One morning she noticed something glinting beneath the slush near the cabin steps. Kneeling, she brushed the dirt aside with her fingers and unearthed a small pocket watch, its surface worn smooth, its glass cracked like spider webs. "Rowan," she called, stepping inside. He looked up from sharpening his axe. "What did you find?" She handed it to him. His face changed. The sharpness in his eyes dimmed into something deeper, older. "I thought I lost this years ago," he murmured. "It was buried just outside." He opened the watch with care, the hinge creaking faintly. The hands were stuck at 2:47. Beneath the cracked glass, a faint engraving caught the light. He turned it toward her. "To my son, find your own time," Ilara read aloud. "Your father's handwriting?" He nodded. "He gave it to me when I was 16. Said a man's time doesn't belong to anyone else. I didn't understand back then." She smiled softly. "Do you now?" Rowan looked at the still hands. Maybe it stopped because I stopped with it." Ilara tilted her head. "Then maybe it's time to start it again." He chuckled dryly. "You can't fix what's been buried this long. Maybe not. But you can still carry it." Her words lingered, sinking somewhere he didn't expect them to. That night, he sat by the fire, turning the watch over and over, listening to the faint rattle of gears that would never move again. It wasn't the brokenness that bothered him. It was what it represented. Time he'd let stand still since his father vanished. The next morning, he found Ilara outside, gathering early wildflowers near the tree line. She smiled when she saw him. "You're up early." "Couldn't sleep," he said. "We've been thinking about that watch." She tucked a strand of hair behind her ear. "And I buried too many things," he said quietly. "Maybe it's time to dig some of them up." Ilara watched him for a moment, then nodded. "Then start small." They spent the afternoon cleaning out the storage shed behind the cabin. Dust, cobwebs, and old memories clung to every object. They uncovered rusted tools, a cracked mirror, and a wooden box sealed with rope. Rowan untied it carefully. Inside were yellowed letters, some unopened, others worn soft at the edges. "My father's writing," he said almost to himself. Ilara reached for one gently. "Maybe he left them for you to find." He hesitated before opening the first. The paper smelled of pine and smoke, the ink faded but legible. "Son, if you find this, it means I couldn't stay. The mountain takes what it wants, but I hope it gives you back something, too. Don't let it harden you the way it did me." Rowan's hand trembled slightly as he read. The silence in the shed felt thick with ghosts. Ilara placed a hand on his shoulder. "He didn't leave you nothing?" "He left you words." Rowan folded the letter and put it back. "Words don't change what's gone." "No," she said softly, "but they can change what's still here." That night, as twilight settled, Rowan placed the broken pocket watch on the mantel beside the spoon and the torn photograph. The artifacts of their shared days and unspoken healing began to form a kind of shrine, not to what was lost, but to what was slowly being found again. Ilara sat across from him, sewing a tear in her coat. "You ever think the mountain's testing you?" she asked. He smirked. "Always. And do you think you're passing?" Rowan looked at her, then at the watch's frozen hands. "For the first time." "Maybe." Outside, the thaw deepened. The streams ran louder, carrying away the last of the snow. Inside, time, though broken, seemed to move again, not by ticking seconds, but by shared silences, gestures, and the steady rebuilding of two lives once fractured by pride and pain. Before bed, Ilara placed a small wildflower beside the watch. "There," she said. "Something alive next to something that's waiting." He smiled, quiet and rare. "You really think it's waiting?" "I think everything broken waits for someone to see it." When the lamps dimmed, the cabin's three artifacts, the spoon, the photograph, and the watch, gleamed faintly in the firelight. Three fragments of two lives, slowly learning how to become whole again. The following morning dawned clear and sharp. The air carried the smell of wet pine and thawed soil. Ilara was mending a blanket when Rowan stepped outside, an unopened envelope in his hand. "I didn't read this one yet," he said. his voice distant. "The last letter." She looked up. "You sure you're ready?" He nodded. "Doesn't matter if I am. It's time." He opened it slowly, the paper brittle beneath his fingers. Inside, instead of words, something folded fell to the floor, a map drawn by hand. The ink had faded, but faint trails still showed. Near the top corner, a small X was marked, and beside it a word written in his father's uneven scrawl, "Home." Ilara moved closer. "What's there?" He traced the ridgelines with his finger. "That's the northern slope, old mining territory. He used to go there when I was small. You think he's still there?" Rowan shook his head. "No, but maybe what he left behind is." The map stirred something restless in him, an old ache for answers buried under too many winters of silence. For days he'd felt the cabin closing in, its walls now too small to contain the ghosts that had begun to speak through relics. That afternoon he packed a small satchel, a knife, a coil of rope, the broken watch, and the map. Ilara watched him quietly. "You're going alone?" He hesitated. "It's my past." She folded her arms. "Then it's part of mine too. I'll come." They set out at dawn. The trail wound through wet moss and thawed earth, the sound of trickling water accompanying each step. Birds returned to the branches, tentative but alive. The world was waking again, and so were they. As they climbed, the air thinned. Rowan's silence deepened, and Ilara let him have it. She could see in his face that this was no mere trek. It was an inward journey. At a clearing halfway up, they stopped to rest beside a fallen cedar. The map fluttered in the breeze as Rowan studied it. "I used to come here with him," he said finally. "He'd teach me how to track deer, how to read the wind. I thought he left because he hated me." Ilara looked at him gently. "And now?" "I think maybe he just didn't know how to stay." They pressed on, crossing small streams and navigating slopes still slick with melting snow. Near dusk they reached the marked ridge. A faint stone foundation rose from the ground, remnants of an old miner's hut, half swallowed by moss. Rowan knelt beside it, brushing away debris. Beneath a flat rock, he found a tin box wrapped in oilskin. His hands trembled as he opened it. Inside were several things: a small leather journal, a photograph of a younger Rowan and his father by a river, and a compass, the same model as the watch, engraved with the same phrase, "To my son, find your own time." Ilara's eyes softened. "He didn't leave you behind, Rowan. He left you a path." He sat back, staring at the objects. "All this time, I thought I was alone." But he was still speaking. "I just stopped listening." The sun dipped low, painting the peaks in amber light. Ilara laid a hand on his shoulder. "Sometimes we don't hear love until we're quiet enough to notice." He smiled faintly. "You've gotten good at saying the things I can't." "Only because you gave me space to listen." They built a small fire near the ruins and spent the night under the stars. The mountain loomed silent above them, but its silence no longer felt heavy. It was vast, steady and alive. In the morning, Rowan buried the tin box beneath the foundation, marking the spot with a small stack of stones. "Let it rest where it began," he said softly. On the walk back down, the wind picked up, rustling through the pines. The map fluttered once more in his hand before he folded it carefully and tucked it into Ilara's pack. "Keep it," he said. "You saw it clearer than I ever could." She looked at him. "What will you do now?" He glanced toward the cabin's distant valley. "Start over, maybe." But this time not alone. They reached home by dusk. The cabin's windows glowed faintly, as if welcoming them back. Inside, the map joined the other artifacts on the mantel, each piece a step in the same quiet transformation. Ilara brushed dirt from her coat and smiled faintly. "You found what you were looking for?" Rowan looked at the mantel, the spoon, the photograph, the watch, the map, and then at her. "No," he said. "I found what I didn't know I needed." Outside, the first spring rain began to fall, soft and steady. And inside, time, broken, buried, and rediscovered, finally began to move again. The morning after their return felt different, lighter somehow. The mountain mist clung to the trees, but the air inside the cabin held a quiet ease that hadn't been there before. Rowan moved slower, deliberate in every step, as if the world no longer chased him. Ilara brewed tea over the fire, the scent of herbs filling the small room. While sweeping near the hearth, she noticed a loose board. It creaked underfoot, a hollow sound. She knelt, pried it up, and pulled free a small bundle wrapped in cloth. "What did you find this time?" Rowan asked from the table. Ilara unwrapped it carefully. Inside lay a pair of old leather gloves, cracked but soft, the lining worn smooth from years of use. One had a stitched patch shaped like a pine leaf. He drew in a slow breath. "My mother's," he said quietly. "You remember them?" He nodded. "She wore them every winter. Said the patch was lucky. After she passed, I couldn't find them anywhere." Ilara turned the gloves over in her hands. "Looks like they were meant to find you now." He smiled faintly. "She was tougher than anyone I knew. Carried warmth in her hands, no matter how cold the world got." Ilara looked at the gloves, then at him. "Maybe she's still reminding you. Keep your hands warm, keep your heart open." He chuckled softly. "You sound like her." She met his gaze. "Maybe that's why the mountain brought me here." They fell silent for a while, the fire crackling low. Outside, the forest was coming alive again. The chirp of returning birds, the soft drumming of meltwater from the cliffs. Life resumed its quiet persistence. Later that day, Ilara began clearing out a pile of fallen branches behind the cabin, determined to make the garden usable again. Rowan joined her wearing the old gloves. The leather fit snugly, though age had softened it. She noticed how gently he handled each piece of wood, as though the gloves had reminded him to treat even harsh things with care. "You're different now," she said after a while. He looked up, squinting against the light. "Different how?" "Lighter. Like you're not fighting the air anymore." He considered that, then smiled faintly. "Maybe I just stopped fighting the past. And what about the future?" He paused, leaning on the handle of his axe. "Haven't thought that far. Maybe it's time to." That evening, while Ilara read aloud by the fire, Rowan sat quietly mending the torn patch on one of the gloves. His hands moved slowly, threading the needle with care. She stopped mid-sentence. "You know how to sew?" He grinned. "Mountain living teaches you all sorts of things. Or maybe your mother taught you before." He nodded. "She did. Said a man should know how to fix what he breaks." The simplicity of that line settled deep in the cabin's air, heavy with meaning. Ilara lowered her book. "And what if what's broken isn't a thing?" Rowan looked up, eyes soft but steady. "Then you start where it hurts most and hope your hands remember." A silence followed, warm, wordless, complete. When Ilara went to wash the dishes, she found the gloves resting on the counter beside her wooden spoon. Rowan had sewn the patch tighter, the thread neat and strong. The pine leaf design seemed to glimmer in the firelight. "You're keeping them?" she asked. He shook his head. "No, they're yours now." "Mine?" He nodded. "You've done more here than anyone since her. The cabin breathes again because of you." Ilara touched the gloves with hesitation. "They don't belong to me." "They do," he said quietly. "You're part of this place now." She didn't argue. Instead, she slipped them on. The leather was cool at first, then softened with warmth. "They fit," she said softly. Rowan smiled, slow and sure. Then they were waiting. As night fell, the two of them sat on the porch, wrapped in blankets, watching the stars return above the dark pines. The mountain loomed quiet, but no longer felt indifferent. It seemed to listen. Ilara's gloved hand brushed against his. For a long moment, neither moved. The silence stretched, but it wasn't empty. It was filled with understanding, with something unspoken that didn't need to be named yet. In the distance, a lone owl called, and Rowan exhaled. "I used to think the mountain was punishment," he said. "But maybe it was a way back home." Ilara nodded. "Sometimes peace wears the disguise of hardship." The gloves rested between them, symbols of both labor and love, of all that could endure through cold seasons and still hold warmth. Inside, the fire burned low, casting long shadows over the mantel where the other artifacts waited. Each one whispered a fragment of their shared story, survival, memory, discovery, and now connection. And though no words passed between them as they sat beneath the stars, something in the air had shifted again. The mountain was no longer just a place they lived. It had become the keeper of their beginnings. The day the music box was found began with rain. Thin sheets of mist rolled across the ridge, softening the edges of the forest. The cabin's roof drummed with a patient rhythm, and inside everything felt close, warm, and safe. Ilara decided to tidy the back room, a task long postponed since the first day she arrived. She found it beneath a stack of moth-eaten linens, a small box of dark wood, carved with delicate swirls and faded blue paint. When she lifted the lid, the mechanism sputtered before releasing a faint melody, fragile, uneven, but hauntingly sweet. Rowan appeared at the door, drawn by the sound. "I haven't heard that in years," he murmured. "You know it?" He nodded. "My mother used to play it at night. Said it was for the wind, not for sleep." Ilara tilted her head. "For the wind?" "She said the mountain listened better when it was sung to." He smiled faintly. "Guess I thought she was joking." Ilara wound the gear again, and the tune stumbled, then steadied. It was a lullaby without words, part sorrow, part serenity. Rowan sat down beside her, eyes distant. "I remember lying on the floor, listening to that sound while she mended clothes by the fire. My father would hum along sometimes. He didn't have a good voice, but she said it was enough." Ilara smiled softly. "That's what love sounds like, enough." The melody slowed, winding down to silence. For a long moment, neither spoke. The only sound was the gentle rain. "Funny," Rowan said quietly. "That little tune outlasted both of them. Maybe that's all memory really is, music that refuses to stop." She closed the lid gently. "Or maybe it's a reminder not to stop listening." That evening, Ilara placed the music box on the mantel with the others. The spoon, the photograph, the watch, the gloves, and now this small keeper of forgotten songs. Each piece seemed to hum faintly with its own life, like the cabin itself had begun to gather its own heartbeat. After dinner, Rowan took the box outside. The rain had stopped, but the sky was low and grey, clouds lingering over the peaks. He set it on the porch railing and wound it again. The sound drifted out into the mist. "What are you doing?" Ilara asked from the doorway. He smiled. Giving the wind something to remember, she joined him, standing close as the melody carried, soft but steady. "Do you ever think your parents would have been proud of what you've made here?" she asked. Rowan's gaze stayed on the horizon. "They wouldn't recognize me anymore. Maybe that's what pride looks like, seeing your child become someone new." He turned toward her, his eyes reflecting the faint light of the lantern. "And what about you, Ilara? You ever think about what your family would say if they saw you now?" She hesitated. "I used to think they'd pity me. A woman sent away like a misbehaving child. But now," she looked around the cabin, the tools, the mountain beyond. "Now I think they'd envy me." Rowan smiled faintly. "You found peace in a place built for solitude. Not alone," she said, meeting his eyes. The words hung between them like a spark that neither dared name. The next morning, the clouds broke. Light spilled through the trees, and for the first time since winter, the air felt warm. Birds gathered near the eaves, drawn by the faint music still lingering from the night before. Ilara opened the box again, letting the melody fill the morning. "It's like it remembers us," she whispered. Rowan nodded. "Or forgives us." He picked up his coat and axe. "There's an old tree down by the creek. Thought I'd cut it before it falls. I'll come help." He paused. "You don't have to," she smiled. "I want to." Together they worked through the afternoon, the song from the music box echoing faintly in both their minds. The rhythm of chopping, the laughter that slipped between moments of effort. The quiet glances all seemed part of a melody the mountain itself hummed along to. By dusk, they returned to the cabin, hands raw but spirits calm. The sun bled orange behind the ridge, and for the first time Rowan reached out, not to guide, not to teach, but to simply hold her hand. She didn't pull away. The music box played once more that night. Its fragile notes filled the cabin as they sat side by side, saying nothing. The melody, though old and trembling, carried something eternal, a promise that peace could be found even after ruin, that love could hum softly in places long silent. When the last note faded, Rowan whispered, "She was right." "About what?" Ilara asked, half dreaming. "The mountain does listen better when it's sung to." Outside, the wind shifted, gentle, approving, and carried the tune away into the dark. The floorboard gave a hollow knock when Ilara stepped on it. She'd been sweeping the hearth, clearing away old soot, when the uneven sound stopped her. Kneeling, she pried it up with the edge of a knife and found a small compartment, a dry space no larger than a loaf of bread. Inside lay a single item wrapped in cloth, a journal bound in worn leather. When she brought it into the light, the pages smelled faintly of smoke and cedar. Rowan, seated by the window mending a boot, froze when he saw it. "Where did you find that?" "Under the floor." She set it gently on the table. "It has your father's name inside." Rowan's hand hovered over it, trembling slightly. "I thought it burned with the rest." Ilara said nothing. She waited, knowing that some memories are best approached in silence. Finally, he opened it. The first page bore the title Cabin Ledger, Year 1. But the entries were not only lists of supplies, they were thoughts, sketches, fragments of his father's life. Rowan began to read aloud, voice unsteady. "Ilara is stitching the curtain she dyed herself. The boy watched a hawk for an hour today. I told him stillness is a kind of strength. He said the hawk looked lonely. I told him that's how freedom feels sometimes." He paused, eyes fixed on the ink. "He wrote that when I was 6. Ilara leaned closer. The next entry was darker, the handwriting hurried. The nights grow colder. Ilara coughs when the smoke doesn't clear. I've been hearing things from the forest again. Cracks that aren't branches, voices that aren't wind. I told her it's nothing, but I see the worry in her eyes. If anything happens, the boy must know. He must never sell this land. It was earned with more than coin." The words seemed to pulse with unspoken weight. "Never sell this land," Ilara repeated softly. "Did he ever tell you why?" Rowan shook his head. "He said the mountain belonged to those who listened. I never knew what that meant. They read until dusk." The final entry was dated 3 days before the fire. Smoke near the ridge again. "Travelers, maybe. The boy asked if we'll ever leave this place. I told him some homes are built for the living, others for remembering. He said he doesn't understand. I told him he will, someday." The next page was blank. Rowan stared at it for a long time, as if willing more words to appear. "The fire started that week," he said quietly. "I was in the stream bed when I saw the smoke. By the time I climbed back, it was too late." Ilara reached for his hand, hesitating only a moment before resting her fingers on his. "He wanted you to remember, not to stay trapped in it." He looked at her then, not with the guarded eyes she'd first met, but with something raw, almost boyish. "I think I finally understand what he meant. Some homes aren't for the living, they're for remembering. But maybe remembering is what keeps the living going." Ilara smiled faintly. "Then this cabin isn't just his anymore. It's ours." They decided to restore the journal. Together, they pressed the pages flat, copied fading ink where they could, and stitched a new cover from spare leather. It became their evening ritual, rebuilding not just the book, but a history. One night, as they worked by lantern light, Ilara asked, "Do you ever wonder why the fire didn't reach this part of the floor?" Rowan thought for a moment. Maybe the wind shifted, or maybe, he smiled slightly, maybe the mountain listened again. She laughed softly. "You're starting to sound like your father." "I'll take that as a compliment." By the time the journal was fully restored, it had become more than a relic. Inside, Ilara began adding her own entries, written carefully beneath the old handwriting. "Today the mountain thawed. The river cracked open its skin of ice. Rowan taught me how to split logs without fear of the swing. I burned dinner again, but he said it tasted like smoke and patience." When she showed him, he grinned. "You're better at this than he was." "No," she said, smiling. "We're just finishing what he started. On the last night of spring, they placed the journal back under the floorboard, but this time, Rowan carved a small mark on the wood above it, a simple shape of a hawk with spread wings." "For him?" Ilara asked. "For all of it," Rowan said. for what burned and what didn't. As they stood, the wind picked up, slipping through the trees with a low hum. It sounded almost like a page turning somewhere deep in the forest. Rowan glanced toward the door. "The mountain remembers," Ilara nodded, her hand brushing the wooden hawk. "And now so do we." Outside, the night settled. The music box on the mantel wound itself down to silence, and in that hush, the journal seemed to pulse beneath the floor, a quiet, steady heartbeat of memory preserved. The fog rolled down the mountain like a second dawn, soft and silver. Ilara followed the stream's edge, her boots sinking into damp moss, her breath visible in the chill. She was searching for firewood when she noticed the hollow trunk, a weathered pine split by lightning long ago. Something metallic glinted inside. She reached in and pulled out a small, rusted compass. Its glass was cracked, the needle twitching faintly as if alive. Turning it over, she found the engraving, "Find where the heart points." Back at the cabin, Rowan examined it under the lantern's glow. "It's old," he murmured. "This kind of craftsmanship, maybe early settlers. But the engraving—" He traced the words with his thumb. "I've seen this before." "Where?" Ilara asked. "In a sketch from my father's journal. He drew a compass like this near the ridge, the same crack in the glass, the same words. He said it never pointed north." Ilara's brow furrowed. "Then what did it point to?" Rowan smiled faintly. "He said it pointed home. They spent the next morning following its direction, or rather, where it refused to point. The needle hovered stubbornly between east and north, leading them through the thicket and across a shallow ravine where frost still clung to the roots. Hours passed before they reached a clearing marked by a half-buried stone. Moss had overtaken it, but carved beneath the green were initials. Iplazar Ilara knelt beside it, brushing dirt away. "Your parents?" Rowan nodded slowly. "Elias and Rowan. This must have been their marker." She looked at the compass again. "Then it worked." He gave a quiet laugh, but his eyes shone with something softer. "Maybe it did. Maybe it just needed to find its way back to where it started." They stayed in the clearing for a long while. The air carried that peculiar mountain silence, a silence that didn't feel empty, but listening. Ilara set the compass on the stone, the cracked glass catching sunlight. Rowan said, "When the fire took them, I thought the mountain turned its back. But now I think it was just waiting. Waiting for what? For me to stop running." She reached for his hand, their fingers intertwining naturally this time. "And then maybe it's time to stop." As weeks passed, the cabin began to change again, small signs of life returning. Flowers, Ilara planted along the window box, bloomed in bursts of violet and white. The roof no longer leaked, and the once broken door now opened smoothly with a polished wooden handle. They settled into a quiet rhythm. Rowan chopping wood, Ilara tending to a small garden that clung stubbornly to the mountain soil. In the evenings, they read aloud from the restored journal or listened to the forest's pulse. But sometimes, Rowan caught her staring at the compass on the mantelpiece, as if it were whispering secrets only she could hear. One evening, he asked, "Do you ever wonder what it really means? Find where the heart points?" She smiled. "I think it means this. You mean the cabin. Not where we came from, but where we stayed." He considered that, then nodded. "You make it sound simple." "It is," she said softly. "The hardest things usually are." One night, as a cold wind swept in from the ridge, they heard a faint knocking at the door. Not the wind, not a branch. 3 slow, deliberate knocks. Rowan grabbed the lantern and opened it cautiously. No one stood there. Only the mist, but on the ground lay a small bundle wrapped in linen. Inside, a folded piece of parchment, old but recently handled. It read, "If you found the compass, then you found what we couldn't finish. Follow it one last time. It will stop when you've arrived where the truth sleeps." Rowan frowned. "This handwriting, it looks like my mother's." Ilara stared at the compass. The needle was moving again. They followed it the next morning. The path wound upward through brambles and frost-bitten soil until they reached an overhang overlooking the valley. There, in the shadow of a boulder, they found a small wooden box, half buried under stones. Inside were 2 things, a silver locket and a folded letter sealed with wax. Rowan opened it slowly. To the one who carries our name. If this reaches you, it means the fire did not take all. What we built was never just a home. It was a promise that love could survive even the mountain's coldest breath. We left the compass so that someday it would guide you not north, but back to warmth. Ilara felt tears sting her eyes. They knew, she whispered. They knew you'd come back. Rowan closed the box and held it to his chest. Maybe that's what the heart points to. Not a place, a person. He looked at her, and in that gaze was every unspoken thing, the grief, the healing, the beginning. That night, back at the cabin, they placed the compass beside the journal and the locket. The wind howled again, but softer this time, like a sigh through the trees. Ilara whispered, "The mountain isn't punishment anymore." Rowan nodded. "No, it's peace." The compass needle stilled completely, pointing neither east nor north, only toward them. As if it had finally found its home. The first snow arrived quietly, as though the mountain were laying down a new page for their lives. It came in the night, muffling every sound, until the world outside became still and white. When Ilara awoke, frost clung to the window's edge in crystalline veins, and the cabin glowed with the soft amber light of the hearth. Rowan was already up, boiling water for tea. He hummed something faint, tuneless maybe, but peaceful. Ilara sat up, wrapped in a blanket, and for a moment she simply watched him. The rhythm of his movements, the way he poured the water, how he checked the window seams for drafts, spoke of a man who no longer rushed against the world, only moved with it. When he noticed her gaze, he smiled. "Sleep well?" "Better than I have in years," she replied, stretching. They spent the morning repairing a loose board in the floor, one that had started to creak louder with the cold. When Rowan pried it up with the edge of his knife, they heard a hollow sound beneath. "There's something under here," Ilara said. He reached down and lifted a small wooden box, its lid dusted with age. The carvings on the surface were delicate, mountain ridges, trees, and a single small bird in flight. "What is it?" she asked. Rowan brushed the dirt away and turned a small key on the side. A soft, hesitant tune began to play. The notes trembled, old but graceful, like the voice of someone remembering a song long forgotten. Ilara closed her eyes. "That melody. I've heard it before." He tilted his head. "Where?" "My mother used to hum it when I couldn't sleep. But she said she learned it from a traveler in the mountains, years before I was born." The box continued to play, slower now, each note fading into the next. On the underside, faint letters were carved into the wood. Elias R. and Clara E. Rowan froze. "Elias and Clara." She looked at him. "Your father's name was Elias. My mother's name was Clara." The silence that followed was not disbelief, it was recognition. Something that had lived quietly between them was finally surfacing. Rowan ran a hand through his hair. "If that's true, then they must have known each other. Maybe more than that." Ilara traced the carved bird with her fingertip. "Maybe that's why my mother always said peace was hidden in the mountains. Maybe she was talking about this place." They sat side by side, the tune still winding down. The air in the cabin seemed to hold its breath, as if the mountain itself was remembering. Later that evening, they brought out the compass and journal again. Together, they compared the handwriting in the journal with the carving beneath the music box. It matched. The same curved script, the same deliberate pressure on each letter. Rowan read from the journal. "She came from the valley, lost and looking for the river. I built her a fire. She stayed until spring." Ilara's hand trembled. "That must have been her." "Then this," Rowan said softly, lifting the music box, "was their memory." She smiled faintly, eyes glistening. "And we found it together." Over the next few days, a quiet transformation swept through them both. The discovery didn't change their tasks. There was still firewood to split, bread to bake, and paths to clear, but something inside had shifted. They spoke less from habit and more from understanding. One evening, as they shared a meal, Ilara said, "Do you think they meant for us to find each other?" Rowan looked at the compass on the mantel. "I think they knew the mountain would guide what they couldn't. And if we hadn't come here?" she asked. He smiled. Then maybe the mountain would have waited longer. It's patient that way. That night, snow thickened outside, draping the cabin in silence. The fire crackled low, and the music box sat open on the table. Ilara wound it once more, letting the tune drift between them. When it ended, she leaned against his shoulder. "Do you ever think we're living in someone else's story?" He looked at her gently. "Maybe, but we're the ones giving it an ending." She nodded, her eyes soft. "Then let's make it a kind one." Outside, the wind moved through the pines with a sound like distant humming, a mirror of the music box's fading song. For the first time since she'd been sent there, Ilara didn't feel punished. She felt chosen. Rowan reached across the table, taking her hand. The broken compass, the journal, the locket, and now the music box, all pieces of a past that had led them here, sat together, forming an unspoken circle of belonging. He said quietly, "I used to think the mountain was where people came to disappear, and now," she asked, "now I think it's where people come to be found." The fire burned steady, reflecting in their eyes. The music box wound down its last note, soft and complete, and the room fell into a peace that words could never touch. The snow had deepened by morning, pressing against the cabin walls with a weight that made the windows hum. Rowan rose before dawn, his breath visible in the dim light, and fed the stove another log. The fire stirred reluctantly, then bloomed, painting his face in slow gold. Ilara was still asleep, her hand resting near the open music box. The melody had long faded, but the air seemed to remember it. Rowan smiled faintly before turning to patch a draught near the chimney. That's when his fingers brushed against something strange, a loose stone that shifted slightly when pressed. He pried it open and found a folded paper, yellowed with time, sealed with a drop of hardened wax. No name on the outside, no markings except for a faint symbol in the corner, a tiny bird carved in ink. "Ilara," he called softly. She stirred and sat up. "What is it?" He held out the letter. "Found it behind the chimney. Looks old." She moved closer, the blanket still wrapped around her shoulders. "Do you think it's from them?" "Only one way to know." He cracked the seal carefully. The paper inside was fragile, but the handwriting was clear, strong, deliberate. He began to read aloud. "To the child who may find this, whether by fate or by need, if you are reading these words, it means time has done what we could not. We once believed the mountain was punishment for our choices, but it became our peace. Elias loved me before the world allowed it, and in our solitude we found what neither family could give, truth. When we learned I was with child, we feared the feud between our kin would never forgive it. So we made a choice. One child would stay with him here. The other would be taken down the valley to safety, under another name. Forgive us for the distance, for the silence. We thought we were protecting you both." Rowan's hand froze mid-sentence. His voice faltered. Ilara reached for the letter, her eyes scanning faster now. The ink blurred where tears had fallen long ago. "If you ever return to the mountain, look for the compass. It knows the way home. And if by chance you meet another who bears the same quiet strength, the same hunger for belonging, listen to the heart before the past. For what we separated by fear, the mountain will someday reunite by grace." The letter ended without signatures, only a final mark, 2 small initials, intertwined. E and C. Rowan stared at it, speechless. Ilara folded the paper in her trembling hands. The silence between them was thick, neither daring to speak the thought that had already bloomed. Finally, she whispered, "Rowan, do you think?" He didn't answer right away. The fire cracked behind him. "If it's true, then we're family," she finished softly. The word landed heavy in the room. The next hours passed in uneasy quiet. They moved around each other gently, as though afraid to disturb something sacred or fragile. The wind howled outside, but inside, the real storm brewed in their hearts. Ilara sat by the window, the letter resting on her lap. "It explains everything," she murmured. "Why my mother spoke of these mountains with longing. Why she told me peace lived here." Rowan leaned against the table, arms crossed. and why my father said the mountain once gave him something worth losing everything for. The realization bound them and separated them in the same breath. What does it mean for us? She asked finally. He looked at her, eyes full of quiet pain. It means we were never meant to be strangers, Ilara nodded slowly. But it doesn't change who we've become. He moved closer, kneeling beside her chair. No, it only explains why we understand each other the way we do. As dusk approached, they stepped outside. The snow had stopped, and the sky above the ridge blazed in deep pink and violet. Everything glittered under the fading light. Ilara held the letter against her chest. They tried to protect us, and in doing so, they made us find each other all over again, Rowan said. Maybe that was their real hope, that we'd heal what they couldn't. They buried the letter beneath the old tree where they'd found the compass weeks earlier. No ceremony, no words, just quiet understanding. When they stood again, the mountain wind passed gently between them. It didn't feel cold. It felt like approval. That night, Rowan lit a single candle beside the music box and journal. The compass lay open beside them, the needle still and calm. Ilara sat nearby, sketching the mountain view in soft charcoal. He said, "You could leave when the snow melts. You've served your punishment. Your father can't keep you here forever." She looked up, meeting his gaze. "Do you want me to?" He hesitated, then shook his head. "No, but I'd understand if you did." Ilara smiled, faint but sure. "I've already left the world I came from. The only thing I want to do now is stay." He nodded once, eyes glistening in the lamplight. The music box began to play softly, its notes fragile as breath, and in that small cabin, surrounded by artifacts of the past, warmed by fire and forgiveness, two lives once divided by blood began to find peace not as punishment, but as purpose. Morning came with a pale stillness that followed nights of revelation. The air had softened. Even the mountains seemed to exhale. Ilara woke to the familiar creak of Rowan's boots on the porch and the sound of him chopping kindling. The rhythm was steady, meditative. She lingered beneath the quilt, staring at the ceiling beams overhead, tracing their grain like the lines of an open palm. Something caught her eye, a small figure carved into the top beam, near where sunlight filtered in through a crack in the roof. She rose, climbed onto the chair, and brushed away a layer of dust. A wooden bird, its wings spread in mid-flight. Its form was simple but sure, the work of a practiced hand. Rowan entered just as she was reaching for it. "Careful," he said, setting the axe aside. "That beam's old." "I found something," she replied, and held it out. He wiped his hands and examined it closely. "It's cedar," he murmured. "Same as the music box. And look," she pointed to the underside, small initials, faint but readable. He smiled sadly. "They really are everywhere, aren't they?" Ilara nodded. "It feels like they're guiding us, showing us how to finish their story." He turned the carving over once more, then placed it on the mantel beside the compass and music box. "Then maybe this is their ending. Or maybe it's ours." Over the next few days, the weather began to shift. The bitter cold gave way to a gentler wind. Snow started to melt, filling the stream with a faint hum that carried through the valley. Ilara and Rowan worked side by side, repairing the fence, their movements in quiet harmony. When they rested, she sketched the bird again and again in her journal, sometimes soaring, sometimes perched, always mid-flight. One afternoon, she asked softly, "Do you think they meant for us to find everything we have?" He looked up from his work. "Not exactly. I think they just hoped love would survive long enough to be found again." She smiled. "And it did." He met her eyes. "It did. There was no need for more words." The space between them said enough, filled not with uncertainty, but with quiet acceptance. At night, the mountain silence felt different, less like emptiness, more like memory. The fire crackled as they sat together, and Rowan began carving a new figure from a block of wood. "What are you making?" Ilara asked. He didn't answer right away, his hands steady and deliberate. When he was done, he held up a small sculpture of the cabin, complete with tiny windows and a single tree beside it. "For the future," he said softly. "Something to remind us that peace can be built even from punishment." Ilara reached for it, her fingers brushing his. Then we should leave it here like they did. Rowan nodded. Let the mountain decide who finds it next. The next morning, they hiked toward the ridge where the compass had once led them. The snow had thinned to patches, revealing green shoots beneath. Birds were beginning to return, their calls echoing faintly through the trees. At the clearing, the same one where Rowan's parents had carved their initials, they placed the small wooden cabin beside the stone marker. Ilara set the carved bird atop it. Together they stood in silence, the wind weaving through their hair, carrying away the sound of their breaths. Rowan spoke first. When I was younger, I used to think the mountain took everything from me. My parents, my peace. But now I see it just waited for me to listen. Ilara smiled gently. And it waited for me to arrive. They lingered until the light began to fade, the sun slipping behind the peaks. As they turned to leave, a real bird, a small grey sparrow, landed on the cedar carving. Its wings fluttered once, twice, then stilled. Ilara gasped softly. Rowan whispered, "Looks like the mountain approves." That evening, back at the cabin, the air carried a warmth that came from more than the fire. The locket glimmered on the shelf, the compass lay still, and the music box hummed its fragile tune. Ilara rested her head against Rowan's shoulder. "Do you ever wonder what they'd think, seeing us here now?" He smiled faintly. "I think they'd say we finished what they started, by finding peace." He shook his head gently. "By choosing it." She breathed deeply, watching the flames. "It's strange, this place that once felt like exile. Now it feels like the only place I was meant to be." Rowan reached over, brushing a stray lock of hair from her face. "Punishment teaches what comfort forgets. Maybe that's why the mountain heals differently." They sat there long into the night, the storm outside reduced to a whisper, the fire dimming to amber embers. When Ilara finally stood to wind the music box one last time, its song filled the room, slow, tender, familiar. She looked around, every artifact in its place, every secret unveiled, and in that gentle twilight, with the carved bird watching over them, they understood that some inheritances are not of blood or name, but of endurance and grace. The storm that night was unlike any before. Wind howled down the slopes, shaking the cabin so fiercely that Ilara feared it might splinter apart. Rain hammered the roof, seeping through old seams, drumming against the window panes like desperate fingers. She and Rowan worked quickly, moving tools and blankets away from the leak near the hearth. When Rowan pried open a warped floorboard to drain the pooling water beneath, he froze. "Ilara," he said quietly, "come look at this." She crouched beside him. Wedged beneath the floor was something dry and compact, wrapped in oilcloth, sealed tight with wax. He lifted it out carefully and unwrapped the layers. Inside was an old leather-bound journal, edges worn, the cover faintly embossed with the initials H.G. Her breath caught. "Harrison Grant," she whispered. "My grandfather." Rowan glanced up, brows furrowing. "The one who sent you here." She nodded, staring at the faded handwriting. "The very same." They sat by the hearth, rain muting the rest of the world, and opened the first page. The ink had bled in some places, but the words were still legible. "The mountain keeps what the world forgets. I built the cabin not for exile, but for penance. For the sins my wealth could not wash away." Ilara's hands trembled as she turned the page. There were maps, hand-drawn sketches of the surrounding valley, notations of trails and springs. Then a name written several times in the margins, Calder Finch. Rowan leaned closer. "That's my father's name." Ilara's eyes widened. Then he knew him. They read on in silence, the storm outside fading into a low, rhythmic hum. Each entry unraveled a deeper connection. Harrison Grant had once employed Calder Finch as a woodworker for his estate. When Calder's wife died in childbirth, Harrison offered him refuge at the mountain cabin, hoping to give him solitude. But tragedy followed, a fire, a misunderstanding, and a disappearance that tore both families apart. One passage stopped Ilara cold. The boy survived. "I sent supplies through winter, but guilt forbade me to visit. His eyes, her eyes, will forever haunt me." If fate is kind, perhaps one day the mountain will let him forgive me. She looked up, her throat tightening. He's talking about you, Rowan. Rowan's jaw clenched. He knew I was here all this time. Ilara closed the book gently. He didn't send me as punishment. He sent me to make it right. For a long moment neither spoke. The fire crackled softly between them. Outside, the storm eased, leaving behind only dripping eaves and the far-off cry of an owl. Rowan's voice was low when he finally said, "All these years, I thought your family ruined mine. But it seems both were just trying to bury the same sorrow." Ilara nodded slowly. "Maybe that's why I felt drawn to this place the moment I arrived. Like something was waiting to be healed." She opened the journal again, flipping to the final page. The handwriting there was shakier, rushed, perhaps written in his final days. If she ever finds this place, tell her the boy on the mountain was never meant to be her warden, but her mirror. For in forgiving him, she might forgive the Grant name, and in forgiving her, he might finally forgive me. A tear slid down Ilara's cheek. She closed the journal and pressed it to her chest. "He meant for us to find this." Rowan reached out, his hand resting lightly over hers. "Then we should honor it." "How?" she whispered. "By finishing what they started, not by repeating their silence." The next morning dawned clear, washed clean by the storm. Mist curled lazily through the pines. The cabin smelled of damp wood and new earth. Ilara placed the journal beside the compass, the music box, and the carved bird. Together, they felt less like relics now and more like witnesses, pieces of a larger truth that had waited generations to be understood. Rowan poured 2 mugs of coffee, handing one to her. "What will you do with what you know?" he asked. She looked out the window, the horizon gilded in soft gold. "Tell the truth," she said simply. "To my father, to the townspeople, to anyone who still believes the lie." He smiled faintly. "And me?" "You stay here," she said, turning to meet his eyes. "This mountain needs you. It always has. But I'll come back, not as punishment this time, but as home." Before she could say more, she noticed something tucked inside the journal's back cover. A folded envelope sealed with wax, the same bird emblem. She opened it carefully. Inside was a single line in elegant script: "When the mountain forgives, so must its children." There was also a key, small, iron, ancient. Rowan recognized it immediately. "That's for the chest beneath the cabin." Together, they lifted the trapdoor and brought out the chest they had nearly forgotten. The key turned easily now, as though time itself had been waiting. Inside were tools, sketches, and blueprints for rebuilding, not just a cabin, but a home large enough for 2. Rowan exhaled shakily. He planned for this. "For us." Ilara touched the edge of one blueprint, her voice trembling. "Then let's build it." As the morning light poured through the cracks in the wall, they began clearing space, sweeping out the remnants of old winters. The journal lay open on the table, its final words catching the sunlight like a benediction. And in that moment, surrounded by relics of guilt turned into grace, Ilara and Rowan understood that forgiveness was not something given. It was built, plank by plank, just like a home. The mountain had turned golden with early autumn, when Ilara made her way back down to town. The cabin stood stronger now, its roof mended, its windows patched, and its hearth glowing every night with life. It no longer looked like punishment. It looked like belonging. Rowan watched her leave at dawn, the mist curling around her like a farewell embrace. He didn't stop her. He knew she had to face the ghosts that waited below. The iron key hung from a leather cord around her neck, cool against her heart as she descended the trail. The forest gave way to the first signs of civilization. Stone fences, smoke from distant chimneys, and finally the outline of her family's estate. She hadn't realized until that moment how small it all looked compared to the vastness of the mountains behind her. Her father was waiting on the veranda, older than she remembered, yet still carrying the sharpness of a man accustomed to control. "Ilara," he said softly. "You came back." "I did," she replied, her voice steady. "But not for what you think." He studied her, the wind burn on her cheeks, the calluses on her hands, the calm in her eyes. "You've changed." "I had to," she said simply. Then, reaching into her coat, she set the old journal on the table between them. "I found this." Grandfather's words. "About you, about Rowan's father. But the lies that shaped us both." His expression faltered. "That place was never meant for you to find." "No," she said firmly. "It was meant for us to remember." Inside the study, the fire burned low. Her father turned page after page, his hands trembling. When he reached the passages about Calder Finch, he exhaled a sound, somewhere between a sigh and a sob. "I thought he died because of us," he murmured. "Because of my father's choices." "He didn't die," Elara said. "His son, Rowan, survived. He's the one who saved me, sheltered me, taught me to live again." Her father's eyes widened. "The mountain boy?" "He's not a boy," she corrected gently. "He's a man who's carried the weight of two families' mistakes." Silence stretched between them, thick as fog. The fire snapped softly, then she placed the iron key in her father's palm. "He wanted us to have this. It opens the chest beneath the cabin, the one grandfather built to last through the years. It held plans for rebuilding, not hiding." Her father stared at the key, its cold surface gleaming faintly in the firelight. "He wanted forgiveness," he said finally, "but he never knew how to ask." "Then maybe it's time we answer for him," she said. Days passed, and for the first time in decades, the Grants opened their estate to the townsfolk, including Rowan. He stood at the edge of the courtyard, uneasy among the polished stone and trimmed hedges. Yet when Elara caught his eye, he saw no judgment there, only quiet pride. Her father approached slowly, the iron key now tied to his wrist. "You're Calder's son," he said. Rowan nodded. "And you're the man who inherited his silence." Her father managed a faint smile. "Then perhaps it's time we break it." He extended his hand. Rowan hesitated, then clasped it firmly. The moment was small, but it felt monumental. The undoing of generations of bitterness. Later, when the crowd dispersed and the sun sank low over the valley, Elara and Rowan walked the edge of the garden together. "I didn't think you'd come," she admitted. "I almost didn't," he said. "But then I thought, the mountain didn't keep me alive all those years just to hide again." She smiled, eyes glinting with the last of the light. "You belong to both worlds now." He shook his head gently. "No, Elara, I belong where you are." Her breath caught, the words hitting something deep and familiar. "Then I suppose I'll have to keep climbing back." He chuckled quietly. "Or maybe I'll come down sometimes." "Deal," she said, smiling. That night her father joined them at the table for supper, their first shared meal since her exile. The firelight danced across the walls, and for a brief, perfect moment, the old estate didn't feel cold. It felt alive. Elara looked between them, the man who had banished her and the man who had saved her, both bound by the same history, both carrying the same key to redemption. As the night deepened, her father spoke softly. "Your grandfather wrote that forgiveness is not something you say, it's something you build." Rowan nodded slowly. He was right. "We started rebuilding already." Elara touched the iron key on the table, tracing its shape with her fingers. "Then maybe this time we'll finish it." When she left the next morning, the valley was bathed in mist. Her father stood on the steps, watching as she and Rowan began the long trek back toward the mountain. The iron key swung gently from her neck, catching the light like a promise. They walked side by side in silence, the world stretching endlessly ahead. For once, the road didn't feel like exile. It felt like returning. And behind them, in the house that had once symbolized distance and pride, the old journal lay open on the table, a new page waiting, because the story wasn't over yet. The mountain had one final secret left to give. The first snow of the new season began to fall, as Elara and Rowan returned to the cabin. It had been a full year since the day she was sent here in shame, a year that had stripped her of vanity, reshaped her sense of worth, and stitched her life back together in ways she never expected. Now, the cabin stood like a monument to endurance. Smoke curled softly from the chimney. The once rotten walls gleamed with fresh pine. Every artifact found within, the music box, compass, journal, and the carved bird, seemed to hum with the same quiet gratitude. Rowan pushed open the door, holding it for her. "Feels smaller than I remember," he said with a faint smile. "That's because we've grown," Ilara replied. She set her satchel down and breathed in the scent of cedar and ash. "This place isn't punishment anymore. It's memory," he nodded, his gaze drifting to the hearth. "Something still feels unfinished." As if summoned by his words, the fire shifted. A log collapsed, scattering embers that illuminated a thin crack beneath the rug. Ilara bent down, curiosity stirring. When she peeled the rug aside, her hand brushed wood, not the floorboard itself, but a hidden plank, loose at one edge. Rowan knelt beside her, prying it open carefully. Beneath the plank lay a small tin box, its corners rusted, its seal intact. Inside, wrapped in oilcloth, was a folded letter bearing the wax crest of the cedar bird. Ilara's heart stilled. "It's his handwriting," she whispered. "My grandfather's." Rowan leaned closer. "Open it." The letter was dated nearly 40 years prior. The ink had faded, but the words remained clear, deliberate, heavy with remorse. "To my dearest friend, Calder Finch, if this reaches you, it means time has at last loosened its hold on pride. I built walls between us, thinking distance would protect what little we had left. But in truth, I only built silence. The mountain knows our story better than any man. It keeps what we lose, until someone brave enough comes to listen again. If they find this letter, let them know what was taken from us was not the land nor the wealth, but the understanding that forgiveness must begin before the heart stops beating. Tell your son, should he live, that mine will one day come to him, not as an enemy, but as kin. There is a key hidden within the hearthstone, not to a door, but to a life rebuilt. I leave this cabin, our shared dream, to whoever still believes in peace. May the mountain keep them both." Elias Grant Ilara's eyes blurred. She folded the letter slowly, reverently. He knew. He wanted this. This ending. Rowan's voice was barely a whisper. He believed we'd find each other. They spent that night in silence, the fire burning low as snow whispered against the windows. Every creak of the beams above, every sigh of the mountain outside, felt like part of a long-awaited reconciliation. At some point, Rowan took her hand. His thumb brushed her knuckles, gentle, grounding. "It's strange," he said quietly. "We spent so long trying to fix the past, but maybe the past wasn't broken, it was just unfinished." Ilara smiled faintly. "Then maybe we've finished it now." He shook his head. "No, we've only started something new." Outside, dawn began to bloom pale gold through the frost. The snow had stopped, leaving the valley wrapped in stillness. Ilara stood and walked to the door, pushing it open to the cold air. From that height, the world looked endless, valleys folded like old maps, trees dusted in light, the sky breathing color into everything it touched. She turned back toward Rowan, her hair catching the sunrise. "Do you think they're at peace now? My grandfather, your father?" Rowan joined her at the threshold. "They are," he said, "because we are." Later that morning, they hiked up the ridge where they had buried the wooden bird and the miniature cabin. The spot was marked now by a circle of wildflowers, life reclaiming what had once been scarred earth. Ilara knelt and placed the letter beneath the cedar carving. "He wanted it found," she said softly. "But I think he also wanted it to rest." Rowan nodded. "Then let it stay here. Let the mountain tell the rest of the story." Together they covered it with soil and stones, sealing it in quiet ceremony. When they stood, the wind picked up, not harsh but warm, brushing their faces like a benediction. Ilara leaned into him. "I never thought peace would look like this," she murmured. Rowan smiled, his voice low. "Peace doesn't always look like stillness. Sometimes it looks like two people finally understanding they were never enemies of fate, just travelers on the same road." As the sun began its slow descent, they walked back toward the cabin, two figures moving through light, through time, through all that had been healed. Behind them, the mountain stood watch. The wind carried the faint sound of a melody, the same tune from the music box, now faint but unbroken, echoing across the valley like memory reborn. Inside the cabin, every artifact remained in its place, glowing in the golden light. The iron key on the wall, the carved bird on the mantel, the music box on the table. And above them all, the final letter's presence lingered like a breath. The story of two families, one love, and the long, gentle work of forgiveness. When night finally came, the fire flickered and dimmed. Ilara rested her head against Rowan's shoulder, the quiet hum of peace surrounding them. "Tomorrow," she said softly, "we start building again." Rowan nodded, his gaze steady on the flames. "Not from punishment this time." "No," she whispered. "From choice." Outside, snow fell again, light, endless, kind. The mountain breathed, the cabin dreamed, and their story, once born from exile, ended in belonging, and somewhere in the hush between wind and wood, it was as if the mountain itself whispered back peace at last.